all that time ago that energy was going to be key to this issue. And my goodness, I struggled to get it on air. Nobody saw energy as a story. Everybody thought it was some sort of flight of fantasy of mine. And now, of course, everybody's doing it, and I can't get near a microphone because I'm killed in the rush. But that's a good thing, and things are moving. I don't know what you guys think to the COP so far, but I've been immensely encouraged by it, particularly by the way the Brits have left the COP on its own to disagree into the middle of the night, being held up by the Saudis as usual, and bolted on things onto it. So the energy stuff that we've seen, which I think was quite impressive, the innovation, forests, methane, all good things bolted onto the COP, and probably will be, I guess, incorporated in some sort of bundle at the end of it all. So I think things are looking up, and the question for me is how fast can we do it? We know what to do, we know we can do it, it's just the question is how fast can we do it, and what sort of a climate's going to be left by the time we get there. Anyway, hopefully we'll talk about a few of those things today, but can I introduce first you to Tony Danker, head of CBI, for his introduction.
Thank you, Roger. I'm going to try and speak from here. Is the mic picking up? Just so we can keep informal. Well, so just to build on what you just said, Roger, I think that's right. I think this is a surprisingly good COP compared to expectations. One global chief executive, who shall remain nameless, said to me the other day, they said, it's very British. It was total chaos getting here, but it's a pretty good show. And I think that's right. And I heard Al Gore speak the other day, and he said, look, in the long arc of COPs, everything doesn't have to be Paris or Copenhagen, right? It's not usually that grand, nor is it usually that bad. And actually, what started, I felt it was a bit of a sort of smorgasbord of stuff was happening. But actually, talking to people in the British government, what I think they're trying to do is build momentum over the course of the 2 weeks. And you can get 40 signatories on something, go for it. That'll turn into 60 or 80 or 100 by the end of next week. If you're waiting all night for the blockers to stop consensus, then you'll wait all night and probably wait a lot longer. So I think, like you, there's a bit of optimism building. I think the second thing that's very interesting about this COP is it is an altogether different level of engagement with business and by business. I've been doing some press interviews yesterday before our dinner this evening, and every journalist was asking me, it's just greenwashing, isn't it? It's just greenwashing. And I said, look, CEOs don't show up for greenwashing. Right? CEOs show up for action, decision, investment. And I genuinely believe, and maybe, by the way, it is entirely my job to say that, but I genuinely believe that is what's happening. I think there is just, again, the long arc, 5 years ago, well, you'll have the better longitude than me, Roger, but 5 years ago even, this was a reputational matter for business. 2 or 3 years ago, this was on the risk register of every CFO. Now it's opportunity oriented. It's absolutely opportunity oriented. And so I'm pretty optimistic. Let me say two things just to set this up, and then we'll keep moving. The first one is, I think the UK energy story is actually a bit of a metaphor for what COP is about. So if you just go back to the sort of Climate Change Act in 2008, that is sort of the government's role in setting targets. And then you think, well, where are we since then? We've cut carbon from electricity generation by 75% since 1990. In the last decade, we've gone from sort of coal being 40% to about 1.8%. We've generated essentially the largest offshore wind production capacity in the world. And we really are, whether or not we can sustain it, I don't know, at the frontier on hydrogen and carbon capture. So there you have the perfect metaphor of a serious governmental target and commitment enshrined in legislation, in turn unlocking corporate behavior. And so I think that's a pretty good metaphor for what COPs should be about and will be about in the future. They tell us that targets matter. And the other thing I think the UK energy story tells us is that frameworks matter. I think it's been really quite funny to see the politicians all go, well, we can give billions, but business give trillions. And it's a slight hospital pass. But I think what's coming next year is, what I'm going to say in my speech tonight is say, okay, challenge accepted. But what does it really take to unlock trillions? And I think we're about to see the role of government change in the next decade from being sort of green rule maker to green market maker. And we're about to learn, and I think the UK is starting to do it quite well, but not perfectly. We're about to learn this idea of what does it mean to make a green market if you're a government. And by the way, if you're the UK government, you're not going to spend as much as the Chinese or the Americans or even the Europeans in terms of public subsidy and public investment. What you're going to have to do is unlock the private market. And just 4 or 5 ideas from me about what it takes to be a green market maker. I hope you're listening, Kwasi and Rishi and Boris. The first one is you need to pump prime markets, right? And actually the heat pump, there's a lot of debates about, 90,000 people get a 5,000 quid off a 10,000 pound heat pump market. But of course, what it's really about is trying to pump prime a market and to start to get to economies of scale. That's pretty interesting. The second one are market mechanisms. You must have covered the offshore wind story. And what you have is a government willing to de-risk and create mechanisms by which you unlock private sector investment against returns. And that is something we haven't yet seen in carbon capture and hydrogen and other areas. Debate whether we've seen enough of it in electric vehicles. But I think that the offshore wind story gives us a clue about the role of government in underwriting markets. The third one, which there has been some focus on this week, is about accountability and reporting standards. And I think this is really going to move fast as soon as we've got accountability and reporting standards. Somebody said to me, governments are fast and businesses are slow. But I tell you something, governments are talking about 2070. The minute we've got accountability and reporting against common agreed standards, this thing will move incredibly fast, is my firm view. 2 more. One is regulatory aims. In UK economic regulation, we worry about 2 things. We worry about price protection, consumer price protection, we worry about competition. There is no explicit obligation on economic regulators to worry about investment or innovation. But actually, that's what we're going to need companies like this to do, right? Is to find a balance between, yes, price protection, and of course, fair market competition, but investment and innovation, and perhaps even net zero. So should we be having explicit mandates for economic regulators to pursue those aims too? And here's a final one, incentives, the tax system, right? We want to develop a tax and incentive system that rewards those who make green investment. And I think the minute that happens, and we reward those who make green investment rather than those, politely I'll say, who don't, then I think, again, that's the roles that governments can play. And I'm pretty confident that if government can get that role right as market maker, we're going to see the energy market and many other markets beside it really take off. Perhaps optimistic, but that's what they pay me for. And it'd be good to hear if you all agree.
Put your hand up if you agree. See, it's at least 3.
Yeah, that includes CBI staff, by the way. You should definitely have your hands up.
What did you think to the Chancellor's announcement, or kind of re-announcement, that firms would be asked to draw up a roadmap, but this won't be mandatory? There was some confusion over that. He kind of said it would be mandatory or moving towards mandatory. Then the Treasury did some Q&A which said, is this mandatory? No, it's not mandatory. And I checked with the press office and they said, no, it's not mandatory. So quite a lot of people are wondering, like, okay, is it worth anything if it's not mandatory?
Yeah, well, look, I think, so my first concern when I saw it was, so I like this, right? I mean, there's a sort of quantitative and there's a qualitative, right? The quantitative is essentially the reporting standards. Carman, who's the global head of EY, said on a panel with me the other day, he said, today's accountants will need to be able to count pounds, dollars, and carbon, because that's the reporting framework we're moving to. So I think from a quantitative point of view, that's that. I think what the transition plan reporting gives you is the qualitative that allows investors, employees, consumers to assess, are you guys, I'm pointing at you all, are you guys doing what you should be doing, and is it credible? Look, I think if it is simple, helpful, impactful, it sounds like a great idea. If it becomes another, place to tell stories, or it becomes a place that confuses people, or if it's completely misaligned with what other countries are doing, then it becomes messy. But
so if the Treasurer, the Chancellor had come up to you and said, look, we're thinking of making mandatory obligations here, what would you have said?
I would have said, that sounds like a great idea if we're aligning the rest of the world. But
that's a no then?
Well, I suspect where he really is and why there's confusion between mandatory and non-mandatory is Britain wants to be a standard setter. On all these reporting areas, Britain wants to be and can credibly be a standard setter. So I think what he probably really is holding back a little bit for is, I really want British companies to do this. I want it to be expected. And then in time, we're trying to move the world to mandatory. So look, I'm not going to, I missed that whole richness of that debate, mandatory or not mandatory. So I want to make sure I haven't missed something important.
He wasn't very rich. It was just a load of headless journalists running around saying, is it mandatory? Is it mandatory? Is it mandatory?
Well, look,
we found out.
Look, I think I don't think businesses are now scared of mandatory reporting. I think they will be pretty, forgive my language, pissed off if it becomes a whole industry of unhelpful time and work. And if we're going to have different standards in different countries, particularly if you're global businesses, but even if you're national businesses and your competitors in other countries get away with it, that will make them really cross. The notion of mandatory accountability, I think everybody is frankly expecting.
Can I just stay on this for a moment?
Yeah.
This isn't what it says on the tin, but never mind, we'll just carry on freelance a bit. If you look at a country like Japan, they had standards on cars. They were high efficiency standards on cars, but also cars had to be narrow because Tokyo streets are so full. Whereas we in the UK, one of our major car manufacturers, JLR, very close to the government, sitting across 6 marginal seats in West Midlands and building very large cars, which frankly, probably, if you're really worried about climate change, you wouldn't be building anymore and wouldn't be selling anymore. So I'm just wondering whether, if you just took those 2 examples, how you would find common ground on standards. And, although I think it looks a great idea, I just wonder if it would ever be possible.
Well, you might be right. I guess the question is, how much divergence in standards is tolerable? And is the net effect of divergence in standards, frankly, to disincentivize private investment? Because then you've lost, if what you've created is poor markets, or markets that are just so very different, then you won't have global companies reform industry sectors to create new business models to create net zero. So look, I guess the devil's in the detail, but I would say some divergence, of course, divergence to the point that actually global companies find the whole thing, they just build new compliance departments to spend endless hours on reporting differently. That's a bad outcome.
Yeah, difficult to do that level of numbers and calculations, though, without a whole department. Anyway, we better move on. We'll come back to these things. Olga Muscat from Bain. You're down to do a welcome message. So perhaps you'd like to do that.
Yeah, sure.
Somewhat belatedly. And then offer us a few thoughts on kind of where you think we are now.
Sure. And it was great to hear Tony, but I think I need to pour a bit of cold water on our enthusiasm. So yes, UK has a good story to tell. Yes, we did.
Hang on a second, you haven't given the Bain welcome for the sponsors' welcome.
I think she just did.
Okay. And our sponsor today, ladies and gentlemen, is Bain.
Yeah, here.
There we go, that's done.
So UK has a good story to tell, but our reduction in carbon emission was in the context of move to a service-based economy. And frankly, from a global perspective, all we did is slow down the pace of the growth in emissions. So on one hand, we could say, yes, we can limit the growth in temperature because we frankly have the technology in generation, renewables at cost parity. We are very close to having the technology in transport. Our analyses are saying EVs will be cost competitive by early 2020s. In heating, technologies have been long established, and we are investing a lot in harder to decarbonize sectors. But on the other hand, this actually links to what you were saying on investment. We need to increase the investment behind sustainability from 1 billion a year to 4 billion a year. And the next wave is no longer big business to big business, which frankly responds much easier to standards, to mandates, to rational regulation. We need to now go to consumers and take consumers, who are also voters, onto the journey.
And small businesses as well.
Exactly. So investment, let's talk about investment. We work a lot with private investors. In fact, we publish every year global private equity report. I'm very pleased to say that global investors are increasingly recognizing the need to take action on sustainability. Those who said it's important have increased from 50% 5 years ago to 80%. But policy matters very much because those actually doing something about it, 85% in Europe, only 60% in America, 50% the rest of the world. And investors are concerned about market design at its largest. Because with actually more interest, competition is increasing, returns are growing, and investment needs to get the return. They are concerned about policy stability. There's the Spain story before of a U-turn on subsidies. There's all the money being lost by investors in energy retail today, which you could say, market design could have been thought through a bit more. And also, a lot of that investment now has to channel close to customer. That is much more difficult to access than big business to big business. And the customer, which is another thing we as Bain are very passionate about, and I'm very passionate about. On one hand, general awareness is growing, and customers are getting there on EVs. Today, even though EVs, as I said, are not yet at cost parity, we are seeing 50% of people already consider an EV or hybrid to buy, even today. But heating is a completely different story. 20% of people will pay more for meat. 20% of people will pay more for air travel. But only 3% would say they will pay more for heating. Wow. And unfortunately, coming back to energy retail, the wave of failures in that market is also creating a step back for us in the trust that we as consumers build in innovation in the energy sector. Just two more points on that is kind of going back to the policy point you were, Tony, talking about, is all this electrification, of course, has then big implications back to the big business. And peak, it's a big issue. We have to basically spend the money to size the whole system from generation to networks to the peak consumption. And whilst we have, on one hand, here in the UK, you could say most competitive, most innovative energy system, actually now, as we go beyond electricity generation into consumer sphere, it's also a system which is most complex because we have to align so many stakeholders to send a strong price signal to consumers and investors to limit that peak. So joined up end-to-end system thinking is really important. And joined up planning at the local level, where we need to increase EV charging by tenfold, where we need to think across technologies of what is the best solution for local area. For example, carbon clusters. Is there a district heating opportunity? Which actually brings me down to my last point on hydrogen. Hydrogen has the potential of being the game changer in harder to decarbonize sectors. The studies that we have done, if the policy support continues, we could have heavy transport on green hydrogen by mid-2020s. We could have heating blending by late 2020s and peaking power in 2030s. That's in our global energy and natural resources report just published. So yes, in summary, we can get there, but we need to very much continue the collaboration between investors, sector, and policymakers. Put customer first, understand how we make it work for customers, finance it from customers, and then unleash the policies that unlock investment.
I have a note here of a question you were happy to tackle. Return on investment in renewables and the supporting network infrastructure has fallen with growing international competition. Is it going to be financeable, further decarbonisation of the UK energy system? So
I think the answer is yes, but. So on one hand, as I was quoting my Bain statistics on that, investor interest is rising. But what investors are looking for, there needs to be a policy action to continue investment going. So first is policy stability and standards. Second is we are very, very close to just the market design is no longer working. Energy market was designed for one-way fossil fuel system where the price is set by a marginal, and I'm sorry I'm going to deep economics here, but actually it's important, marginal fossil fuel plant. This is already breaking today when we have, frankly, relatively little wind and you have huge correlation between energy prices or electricity prices and wind strength. This market is not going to sustain a new wave of energy, which
it's not going to sustain one, you say?
In the future. We need a
Sorry,
market.
just to clarify, I couldn't say whether you heard now or not. This market is going to sustain or is not going to sustain?
We need to change how electricity is priced and how electricity market works in order to be able to accommodate the future growth in renewable generation, which is very heavy fixed cost and which is intermittent, because our market design is based on fossil fuels. What we also
So how are you going to do that? I mean, if you're the governor of the Bank of England, not governor, but if you're the chancellor, how do you achieve that? Business secretary.
So there is a rethinking of what is the basis on which you price electricity. We have capacity markets which pays you for being available versus for generating. Those markets need to come more closer together than they are today.
And what about consumers? I mean, are we going to move much further into demand management, do you think?
So
Companies moving into demand management?
This is a great point. So from consumer perspective, first of all, the price signal can be stronger if we incorporate into that price signal also the value of avoiding additional network, so by managing peak down. And we just have to make it easy. So automation by default, setting standards that all charging is automated, and we can have the value maybe for customer is not great, but why wouldn't you have that benefit if you have the confidence that your car is charged in the morning to put the charging to reduce the peak. Basically, don't charge 5 p.m. on a winter night.
I'm always slightly puzzled why demand management hasn't got more press and more interest. I reported a few years ago, and I went to a tarmac plant near Heathrow, where they have a capacity, I don't know what the melting point is of tarmac. Somebody in the room will shout out if anybody knows the melting point of tarmac. No, what a useless lot. The melting, let's say it's between 140 and 160 or something. So the computer would get a message saying, actually, there's going to be a lull in the wind, crank up your temperature to 160. So they crank it up to 160. Then the computer sends another message saying, okay, turn off now. We need the power that we would have been giving to you, and they turn off, and slowly it gets to 140 degrees. They haven't lost anything at all, and they get paid a whole stack of money for it. And then I went to a local hotel where they had the air conditioning on the same system, and it was a water-cooled air conditioning system, and they could switch it off for an hour or two, and because the water would hold the warmth or the coolth, nobody noticed. I sat in the hotel, nobody noticed that demand management was operating. And again, they were being paid for that. So I just kind of wonder, why isn't everybody kind of snatching this off the tree?
So I think this goes back to the point I was making earlier, that our energy system is very fragmented and it's very complicated. So that wholesale price and then the benefit that creates for the network goes to a retailer who resells it to individual customers. From their perspective, from an individual on electricity currently, it's a small difference, but from a country perspective, it's a big difference. And first, that price signal needs to be amplified, adding the value of the cost, so then the difference is bigger of the avoided network cost. And the second is the retailer engagement with a consumer is not that easy to send back and forth those messages. So this is where automation comes in. And if you have to do it manually, you are not going to get the response for the relative small benefit. Then if this is a benefit, you're going to get for just installing a device.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to Fabien Viau, who's Regional Director in charge of Energy and Data Center Location Strategy for Google. Tell us where you think we are at the moment in terms of COP, the move towards net zero, all that stuff.
Yeah, so Google has started the climate journey 15 years ago. We were carbon neutral in 2007. And we wanted to do more. Our funders very early on, just were very close to this topic. So we started signing corporate PPAs in 2010, and several of them eventually being able to reach 100% equivalent of our consumption at the end of the year. That was in 2017. And very pleased to see that the ecosystem, just built into that. We were not the first one, we were one of the first one, but we see just a lot of people copying corporate PPAs and corporate PPA being more and more available to everybody and in more and more regions. This was good, but to be honest, in what it means when we say we are 100% renewable energy, it means that we are, at the end of the year, if you look at how many electrons of clean energy that we've put in the system, it's equivalent to what we consume on the other side of the system. And as we said, the renewable energy is volatile. Just there is not always sun, there is not always wind. So while the sum is zero, it's at the end of the year. So we felt it was not enough, so we're raising the bar, and now we're aiming at 24/7 carbon-free energy by 2030. This means that in every single area of the world where we operate, data center or offices, everywhere, and we will operate entirely in carbon-free energy on an hourly basis. So the switch here is that we're not talking about yearly sum to be zero. We're really talking about an hourly check, and we're not talking only about a global, matching. We're talking about a local matching. So locally, if we think about Germany, in Germany, we want for every hour of 2030 to be, just carbon-free energy only. Just Google data center and facilities will be operated on carbon-free energy. This is extremely ambitious. To be honest, we don't know exactly how we're going to achieve it. It's why, we set the goal at 2030. There are various elements that we can use. Of course, we can continue doing power purchase agreements that work. Now we try to be much smarter. We try to look at what would be complementary to what exists in the grid, what would be complementary to what we have today, just in our portfolio ourselves, to make sure that we are not adding wind to wind, which maybe is not, just beneficial.
Can you give us a few examples of that?
Example is, for instance, if you look at Chile, where we have just a facility, we have Chile as already it's a country which is pretty advanced, and the grid is pretty low carbon, but still just the carbon several in various hours of the day. And it's mainly solar production, so the day, and we have ourselves a corporate PPA over there, which is solar. And now we're analyzing the situation, and to increase our percentage of carbon freeness, if you want, on an hourly basis, we need to sign a wind PPA. We need to sign, we need to install some storage to be able, just to take electrons which are overproduced in some moments, clean electrons, to re-inject in the grid at the right moment. So we're putting that analysis into that. And where it's important is, and why we're talking here today is, this is our journey, and we are talking about it because we'd like others to, just to be inspired by it. We want to be inspired by others also, and that's the benefit of being to the COP. Beyond that, I think, the technology, especially the digital technology, has a big role to play in solving that problem. As we were talking about demand shaping, we're working on it. We've done a pilot where while we can't control everything in our data centers, for instance, if you search something right now, you want the answer right now. But for instance, if we are, I don't know, just copying one file to, just for replication, maybe we can wait that. And, we've done a pilot where we try to time the compute based on the carbon freeness of the grid at that moment. And if, for instance, in Nevada, there is no, the energy in the grid is, just too carbon intensive, we say, oh, let's wait and let's time it, and we'll do that, just in 6 hours when the wind will blow.
So what is it that you actually wait? What do you put on pause in those circumstances?
We don't start the work. We don't start the video, just copy, for instance. We don't start, I don't know, the whatever encryption, whatever analysis, whatever, just compute has to be happen.
So your workers wouldn't know, but somewhere there would be a computer that was having a little rest.
Exactly, and either, but what is good is that you can it doesn't work for the whole, just every single task, but it can work for some tasks where you can time it in the day, or you can even, switch it from one place to another. Let's say, just again, in Houston, it doesn't work right now, just there is too much carbon in the grid. We switch to Finland, and we're going to do it in Finland instead. And so that's an example. There is other example. I think artificial intelligence has a lot of just potential. Of course, just to make the data speak, and just to be able just to inform people about just what we have today in terms of emissions, in terms of various elements. So just that's our message today. As far as my personal opinion about just these few days I've spent in the COP, I think just there is great momentum. I'm very, very pleased to see that momentum. I think just everybody seems to be convinced. It seems to be looking in the right direction. I'm anyway fairly worried about the timing. I think 2030 seems far for many. Just for me, I feel super close. The way I think about it is that I may be pessimistic, but we're already in 2022. More or less. 2025 is 3 years from now, very short. And 2025, we're going to be heads down delivering for 2030. So the targets are good, and I'm very pleased with all the targets that have been raised. But we need to action. We all need to work together, and it's not only corporates, not only government, it's not only NGOs, it's all together. So I'm very pleased to see this working. But I think keeping a certain worry is good also, because we need to act. We should not stop, certainly.
And in a moment, I'm just going to come to Fiona, who's from Octopus Electric Vehicles. Before I do, let me just stay with you a minute and ask: are you using EVs as part of your own backup? So when people come in, plug in the EV, it acts as a battery, takes in power off the grid?
We're not.
Why not?
That's that's a good question. I think that's something we need to check. I think the short answer is certainly it's much more complicated than what we think. But is there a journey to that? Certainly. The thing we can say is that we're piloting right now in Belgium the replacement of diesel generators by batteries. And it's not only a good thing because we would replace diesel genset by batteries, but we're also making that batteries available to the transmission system operators, ELIA, for them to manage the grid and help them balancing. So this is only the start. It's certainly not enough. And there is a lot of good ideas, and we should work more. But this is already something, and we need just to do it 10 times more and 10 times faster. That's the only thing.
Okay, thank you, Fiona Howarth from Octopus. You're going to tell us how we could all use our cars as storage batteries and run our homes from them in the middle of the night and stuff, aren't you?
Job done. Thank you. There's so much I want to respond to, and I'm going to use this opportunity to also try and persuade you that it's simple and not that complicated. So if those of you that don't know Octopus, we actually have about 13 different businesses within the Octopus Energy group, including supplying renewable energy to about 3 million homes in the UK. We have about £3.5 billion worth of energy assets, renewable and solar, wind and solar under management. And we're installing EV charge points, smart meters, and my business particularly makes it as easy as possible to switch to electric vehicles, including salary sacrifice, which you should also investigate later. In terms of the energy transition, so I got really excited about this and the demand side response about 10 years ago, and looking at all of this kind of intermittent energy that was going to be coming onto the grid, and how we were going to balance that. And of course, at the same time, you see then those graphs of the rise of EVs at the same period of time. And all of those energy assets sitting there over 90% of the time, stationary on people's driveways. I was like, that's pretty cool. And somebody's like teaching me about demand side response of vehicle to grid. And your average car battery at the minute can store enough energy to power a UK home for about 5 days. I'm like, that's really cool. So I came across...
Sorry, does that include heating, or is that just electricity?
That's electricity. That's typical home consumption on the basis of gas boilers at the moment. So
okay.
I agree that there will be an increasing consumption for heating. That's a good point. But also we're seeing a trend in terms of those batteries getting slightly bigger as well and getting more efficient, etc. But so there's a good energy storage capacity sitting there in driveways. And we're expecting now, I think, about 14 billion electric vehicles on our driveways by 2030. So that's a huge, huge amount of capacity. Now, at Octopus, we've got a tech platform which actually enables us to run on half-hourly data. And so we can start to use time-of-use tariffs. So actually one of the things that we did early on when I was there was having EV tariffs. So we've got a tariff in the middle of the night where it drops to about a third of the price of typical energy. It's about 5p per kilowatt hour for 4 hours. And actually we see a huge number of people then getting on board with that. And then we brought out another tariff which follows the wholesale market price. So typically a wholesale market price is pretty cheap overnight, they'll peak in the morning and then a big peak between 4 and 7. A lot relating to the cost of the grid actually. And so people are then creating smart technology that are taking the price signals from this and automatically charging up and discharging, automatically charging up their cars or batteries or whatever it might be during those very cheap hours. So we saw actually the peak consumption of those homes drop by about 50% if they had EVs, while they shifted their behaviour into the middle of the night, and it's all been automated. And actually what we do at some points, of course, we give subsidies to wind turbines, wind generators. And at times we don't want them to be generating, so we'll pay you that wind subsidy not to generate. So we're paying them not to generate. We're whoa, don't pay them not to generate, let's pay our EV drivers to charge up. So this tariff actually goes negative sometimes. And last year over a bank holiday, there was this guy, he actually got his dad round to help charge up as well to make use of this. They filled up enough into their cars to take them London to Newcastle and back and got paid £5 for the pleasure. It's like turning up and filling up your car with,
Did that get in the papers? I mean, that's a great story.
We did get a piece, one piece, but it did very well.
Me.
Yes, next time I will.
Afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. We'll exchange details because that was super exciting, right? That is
fantastic.
That's demand side response live there, and people change their behaviours, and it was all automated as well because
Taking Watts to Newcastle.
Well, yeah.
Oh, pretty good. Thank you. It was a bit slow, but still worth it.
And then we've taken it further. So supported by Innovate UK, so Department of Transport and Bays, we have rolled out now 135 Nissan Leafs with vehicle-to-grid chargers that are charging up in the middle of the night and now supplying energy back to the grid at peak times. So but part of the question that you gave to Olga earlier, right? How are we going to actually make this work better? At this point in time, those energy price signals are not very clear. Okay, they're blurred by things like policy subsidies, right, that are smeared across energy pricing at all times of day. So that's not actually reflecting the cost of the energy at that point. And then the other part is also the grid pricing. So National Grid and local distributed network operators, or DSOs as they are now, they also don't have flexibility and pricing signals that reflect the usage of the grid at that point. So we need to have more flexible pricing signals to really compensate consumers for using energy at the times when it's cheap and green, basically. So that would really help.
Sorry, let me just ask you, do you think consumers can handle that? I mean, I'm really useless at this bit of data and that bit of data, and I think, oh God, just if there was somebody I really trusted, just say, okay, just do this. Okay, just make my house run like this. Then I would pay them and I would do it.
But I completely agree. So what we've seen is, well, a number of things. One is that Go tariff, the Octopus Go tariff, which is the very simple one. People move on to that, and it's like entry level. And then they see people using these more flexible tariffs, but also they've learned about technology that can control it for them. It just switches it on and switches it off. So the cheap tariff starts at 12:30 at night. I don't want to have to get out of my bed and go and plug it in at 12:30 at night. I've just got smart tech that does it for me. And I know that it's not charging at midnight when I go to sleep, but still when I wake up in the morning, it's fully charged, or 80% as I set it to. But then they move on to the next tariff, which is that more flexible one, and is a bit more unpredictable. But again, the tech just does it all for them. So we've made our APIs available, and smart tech companies have come along and integrated with that. And they're integrating with that for charging, but also for other appliances as well, batteries, heat pumps, etc. They can all integrate with these smart tariffs. And so it just makes it super easy. I'll tell you another story as well, though, which is I used to work at Hive, which is where you can control your heating from your mobile phone. And there's this theory, right, which is when people leave their homes, you can see that from your phone. Your phone has geofencing, geolocation. It's like, okay, you've left your home. Okay, Roger, would you like to turn off your heating? Oh, yes, I would. Day 2, Roger, would you like to turn off your heating? I see you've left your home. Oh, yes, I would. Day 3, Roger, would you like me to turn off the heating every day when you leave? Oh, great. Yes, please. And you learn to trust it.
I like that. I can't even control my children by mobile phone.
Luckily, this is tech, so it's much simpler than humans. It's much more predictable and rational. So, it can all just be sorted out. And there's a question around heat pumps as well, and whether or not people are on board with heat pumps. You know what? A number of years ago, people weren't on board with, EVs necessarily, and you get your early movers. And we tell this story around, at your barbecue over the summer, or maybe it's your Christmas dinner now, and somebody used to turn up, and they turned up with their Nokia mobile phone, and they were telling you about it. Then they turned up with their smartphone, and you learn about it that way. And then they turned up with their smartwatch, and now they're turning up with their EV, telling you about how they've charged it up overnight at a tenth of the price of what you paid for your petrol to get here. And now next year and the year after, they're going to be turning up talking about heat pumps. And that's how we learn. And you see it with solar as well. You walk into a street, there's solar at one house, and it's on all the other houses. Because people talk, they adopt the technology, and they share it with their neighbours, their friends, and their family. And that's what we've seen with EVs. And actually, our stats show that it's over 70% of people in the UK now are considering EV for the next car. It's all about scale and pace now, and doing it smartly. And
a thought before we move on big picture, the situation, COP, timetables, all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I'm enthused per some of the conversation earlier. I think this is a huge opportunity. This is like a transitional market, a lot of opportunity to seize kind of spaces in that market and grow. And I think it is bonkers for anyone not to be seeing that and getting on board with it. But it's really about the ability to do that at pace and at scale. And I think there was a question or a point you made around the 2030 number. If we want to hit, I think it was like halving basically our carbon emissions by 2030, right? For the one.
That's right, yeah.
So specifically, I do a lot on leasing of EVs. We can't get enough EVs at the minute. We've got lead times on those EVs, up to 12 months for some of the cars. We just cannot get enough. And there's a chip issue as well, which is blurring the lines, but it's still really difficult to get them. And you saw Elon's tweet after the 100,000 Hertz order, right? He's like, I'm really surprised that impacted our share price, because it's not about demand. Tesla's all about a production scaling challenge now, and we're going to see that across all of these car manufacturers. But really, if we want to hit halving our carbon emissions by 2030 in that space, we kind of need to stop buying petrol and diesel cars in the next 2 years. Right? So actually, we need a huge
Well, we need
shift.
to stop doing a lot of things, but the government doesn't want to impose anything on its citizens. It thinks everything can be done by technology. But I mean, I'm really fearful about the ability to just supply the amount of kit that's needed. There's apparently enough finance. They were saying yesterday, 130 trillion. We were talking about that this morning in this hall. But actually, where are we going to get all the steel for those wind turbines, all the concrete that's needed, and the factories that are needed to build stuff? I'm kind of dubious about how that can be done in time, even if there's the money.
Yeah, we're hosting 40 leaders, experts, and policymakers next week to discuss what those challenges are going to be to scaling EVs. And I thought, cobalt, lithium, the obvious ones. And actually, some of the early conversations, the interviews we've been doing in the run-up, are highlighting things around copper and nickel, where you need a huge amount of copper across decarbonising a lot of things. So I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity to innovate. So do we use less of it? Can we innovate to use less of it? But also, are there different business models? So if we can't get enough EVs, actually, do we look to car share a bit more? And that, will those business models come through as a bigger opportunity? So again, I feel like this is a world of opportunity to try out new things and grow new businesses off the back of it. So
your comment, so kind of throwaway comment about stopping buying conventional cars, how does that fit with not being able to build enough electric cars?
Well, that's what I suggest, where we look for alternative ways to kind of fill that space. So how do we look to have more car sharing opportunities? There is an appetite absolutely within drivers now to make that switch. So
how do you instance that?
What?
Well, what proof do we have that drivers are willing to go car sharing and stuff? They like their own music and their own perfume and.
So I think you're right. They're willing to go electric.
Yeah.
And so I think then there's an opportunity for us to investigate other ways to help enable them to go electric, or even walk and cycle, of course, which is what we should all be doing if we can. Before.
Well, I cycle in London, but I don't think you catch me cycling in Glasgow. If you've seen these hills, they're ridiculous.
Electric bikes.
Electric bikes, yeah. Electric bike is the future, yeah, without a doubt. Okay, Raphael Vallée, Senior Manager of Climate Policy and Strategy, Macquarie green investment group. Some thoughts from you about kind of the state we're in and the state we're going to.
Yeah, so just to give a quick introduction to Macquarie, so we're the world's largest manager, developer and investor of infrastructure, so we talk a lot about energy, and Green Investment Group within the business is our specialist green investment arm, and quite interestingly, we announced last week that we're shifting that business where so we acquired the business as when it was the UK Green Investment Bank in 2017, and that then lived in the investment bank side of the business, and we're now shifting that as of next year into the asset management business to reflect some of those changes in business models that we're seeing in energy in particular. So I guess to pick up on there's lots to pick up on now, but to pick up on some of the points around energy markets, you talked about falling costs of renewables. I think that's fantastic. It's a really, really great story, and without those falling costs, we couldn't get the scale that we need, and we still need to install about 4 times capacity a year than we are now, so falling costs is pretty good news from that perspective. And I think what that means really for investors is just that the business model is changing. So when renewables used to be pretty high risk, high revenue, now it's becoming much lower risk, lower revenues, but also very stable and predictable revenue. So that's attracting just different players in the market. So and that reflects our move in Green Investment Group, where it used to be a great investment banking play, and now it's more of an asset management play where we have much more patient capital and providers of finance that are looking for these low stable returns. What I would say, though, is that the market mechanisms and the policies that got us to this success, especially in the UK, are less and less fit for purpose. So I'd actually argue that the market is very skewed towards renewables. So feed-in tariffs, contracts for difference, have really protected renewables from the kind of shifts and great instability in market wholesale prices that we've seen in energy. So we're seeing issues now, especially in Europe, where because renewables are such a great proportion of the energy mixes in countries, creates huge fluctuations. So on a really sunny, windy day, renewables are flooding the grids with electricity that people don't necessarily need to use. And at the moment, we're not yet absorbing that in energy storage solutions, and we are moving towards that. But we're getting seriously low negative prices. I think Germany last Christmas got like minus 60 euros per megawatt hour for a few days. And at the same time, when renewable generation isn't happening, because they've been pushing out that the more kind of dispatchable types of energy, which at the moment is fossil fuel, we're seeing really high energy prices. I think Spain last month got like 180 euros per megawatt hour. So we really need to rethink how we're regulating markets, how we're pricing markets, because we're seeing big distortions, and these are things that I'm not seeing being talked about very much.
Well, how can you get over that? You know, the wind blows when it will and the sun shines when it will. And we know we need better storage systems. People have been talking about it for years. Some are coming through. Hydrogen is obviously one potential vector. What are we going to do, and why can't we move faster?
So I think demand management is one answer, and then flattening that generation curve. So that extra energy that renewable generate, putting it into battery storage, which is really great for short term. So say flatten the curve throughout one day, or into hydrogen, I think is going to be the answer. But also not shunning straight away that dispatchable types of energy that we need, making sure we decarbonize that very quickly with things like CCS in the short term.
Yeah, but that's not very suitable, is it, CCS, for short-term energy, because it costs so much to get the plant up and running and the CO2 pressurized. My impression is that it's not a backup technology. Am I wrong?
On the basis that we might continue to need to rely on things like gas in the short term, we might just need to plug in CCS on infrastructure that already exists. And to make the economics of that work, we need to rethink how we price renewables versus dispatchable energy, because we are skewing massively towards renewable, which is also great, but isn't particularly helpful in terms of managing these big spikes and troughs in wholesale market prices. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done. And even though I'm not hearing about this being talked about from the IEA or IRENA, these are kind of price cannibalization issues and things that we're starting to be quite worried about in finance. But quite positively, the UK government consulted on that earlier this year, and they are thinking about making quite big changes in how they approach market pricing and contracts for difference and some of those kind of very traditional subsidy mechanisms that we've relied on for.
Can I ask you a stupid question? Why exactly does it matter if there are price fluctuations? If you've built anticipation at the start of the year that you're going to suffer price fluctuations, does it matter, and in what way?
Well, it matters for consumers and it matters for the providers of finance. So we like nothing more than stable, predictable revenues, and that's just not happening.
But can't they see over a year that they will get X amount of electricity per year? And I know actually, it's quite noticeable now the amount of electricity is fluctuating from year to year, but not kind of on a massive scale. Why didn't they just say, okay, we'll look at this over a year, we won't worry about from today to tomorrow?
Well, firstly, the renewables are very weather dependent, and if we know anything about climate, is that we can't really rely on all the weather patterns, so it is actually quite difficult to anticipate. The other thing is that the trends we're seeing is because we're pushing for so much more renewable to come online, we are also pushing out dispatchable energy, so we might see even bigger spikes, and that's quite difficult to anticipate and to model. So no, it's not that.
Can we not solve it all with batteries and demand management and pumped hydro? Actually, there's any way to pump any hydro.
We can. It's just that the policy mechanisms and the regulation isn't quite in place to allow us to do that. And I think that's really the big story in energy or in net zero, is that we're right here wanting to spend that money and wanting to develop those assets. We just need the right enabling environment to do it. It's not about necessarily mandating us to do these sorts of things. It's just enabling the private sector to hit the ground running.
I wonder if perhaps there hasn't been enough attention on it, because typically the people who've been saying, ha, the wind's not blowing, your climate change sucks, or something similar to that, they tend to be climate skeptics. And so maybe their argument, an obviously truthful argument, that there is a problem with intermittency, maybe that hasn't been examined properly because it was considered to be a climate skeptic argument. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't think it's an argument against renewables. It's just saying that we need to completely rethink how we generate energy, and it's creating lots of business opportunities for finance and for corporates. So I don't think fundamentally that's a bad thing, but it's something we need to look at very carefully if we want to start moving into subsidy-free spaces for renewables, because at the moment the pricing is so unstable. I don't see how we can quite step into not relying on subsidies, because that's pretty much the only thing that guarantees that stable revenue at the moment.
But presumably you'd have to pay subsidies for the dispatchable power as well.
Yeah, we might be looking at that, but it could be that we do it differently. So instead of having a price for the energy that you generate or that you store, you could have floor prices. It's also the kind of thing that you can manage.
Sorry, I don't understand that. What would that? What's a flow price?
So as a floor price, so you just guarantee a minimum price as a...
Oh, floor price. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
I beg your pardon.
Terrible French accent.
Okay, look, I'm going to throw this open now to the audience. There's, goodness me, it's a lightning hand there.
Microphone coming.
We'll go first to the man with the lightning elbow, and let's take another couple while we're there. Can I see any more hands? Was that a hand at the back, or were you just waving? No. Okay, we'll stick with this one. And there's another gentleman here. Let's take these two, and then we'll dispatch them.
Yeah, sorry about lightning, but it's my specialist subject. So.
Yeah, just do tell us who you are and where you're from.
My name's Gordon Edge. I'm from the Low Carbon Contracts Company, which runs the Contract for Difference, which Tony was very complimentary about, which is a very upstream, kind of broad market policy instrument. The cost, the price risk is taken away from generators and socialised across everyone, which I think if we go down that route, the problem, into inverted commas, of price volatility goes away. Ultimately, consumers only pay that fixed price, and the short-term cost, the market price signals, become a signal to people with batteries or demand management to run or not run. And as long as you forget that it's got nothing to do with the investment part of it, which is done by the CFD or indeed the capacity market, which we also settle, then there's your market design, which can cope with all of this. But I'm interested in how end users like Google, or indeed people with their EVs, how does that work when we've got this upstream policy, which takes away the problem for investment? how do you integrate that end use and those people doing those interesting things at the end use? When, if you've dealt with it at the upstream level, do you have to worry about it? It kind of excludes that action. Am I making myself at all clear?
I think so. We're going to stick with that question because it's so specific. I don't want to go to the other one for a minute. Fabien, do you have any thoughts on that?
I'm not sure I totally got the question. Maybe it's my...
Okay, well, this is a really interesting point, so let's bottom this out. Say it all again, slowly, backwards. Well, not backwards, I made that bit up.
So, in the UK, we've got the CFD, which is really all about getting generators away with a very low cost of capital because it takes away that price risk from the developer. But it then socialises that cost or even benefit. At the moment, we're going to be paying back suppliers because power prices are so high at the moment. At the end of this quarter, we'll be giving money back because of the nature of the CFD. But because that price risk is socialised across everyone equally. So it's like, where's the differential at the end user level when essentially all of that is being done by big policy at the front end? You know, what's the role of the end user when the big policy is kind of doing it? Is that?
So why don't they do more to take up the slack? Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm saying that actually there's relatively little slack because you're trying to do it at a system level with these big policies. Whereas clearly there are things you can do at the end user. If Google wants to match all of its demand with low carbon power hour by hour, when the whole system is being decarbonised by the big policy, I mean, do you need both?
Do you need both?
And do you need both? That's the question. Yeah. I'd say, from where I'm sitting, it looks like you don't. Is there a role for the end user to also take action? I think just go, I don't have to worry about it. The policy is taking care of it.
Raphael?
So two thoughts. One, when the grid is totally decarbonized, we don't have to do anything. And I'd love that to be tomorrow. What we're trying to do is demonstrate that this is an approach which enable the grid to decarbonize. So we're showing, just a certain direction, and eventually, just this will decarbonize the grid, which will benefit, the whole economy, transportation, buildings, and other industries. As far as the CFD, so it gets a bit technical maybe for me, but I know that sometimes the issue of those policies is that it limits what corporate like us could do. We're ready to sign corporate power purchase agreement. And I know that, for instance, in France, up to recently, it was not really possible, just for us to act in any manner because the system was designed in such a way where, there was no room for us. People, the developers didn't need, just us. So even if we were willing to do things, to invest and, just to drive more developments, there was no room for us. So the idea here is to make sure that the policy is adapted to serve, just all the users, because everybody doesn't, just have, active people working on the topic, but also for the people who wants to actively contribute to have enough room and for the policy to enable us to act. And this is actually something we do. We spend quite a lot of time on policies to, especially in certain, just part of the world where, it was not possible to purchase directly renewable energy before. And we had to work with the governments and explain and work with other parties to enable that. And when the law changed, then after you can act.
Okay, thank you. Is there any other member of the panel?
Yeah, I was just reflecting on the question because I think there's two different things. So the CFD is designed, of course, in terms of encouraging more renewables onto the grid, versus the time of use stuff that I was referring to earlier in terms of the flexibility is more an in-day consumption and matching up throughout the day. So for me, there's two different things that we're trying to challenge or trying to tackle with those. And with what I would say is the CFD, we should look at that in terms of how that might then be shared across pricing throughout the day, because at the minute, not every kilowatt hour at different hours is worth the same. And so at the minute, because it's smeared evenly across those different hours, it's blurring it. But I do think that there is a purpose for both and they're slightly different. And I think it's delivering on a different need than the in-day flexibility.
Okay, thank you. Let's take the gentleman who I was going to go to before I cruelly snatched the microphone away from him.
Hi, Paul Spence from EDF, and if I may, I'd like to ask a two-part question. The first part is I was very struck by Olga's reference to the current challenges in the retail sector and the implications or impact that might be having on trust. I just wonder if you saw any other implications of what we're seeing at the moment in terms of the very high prices and the impact that that's having. And then, if I may, secondly, is I would just observe, being from a company that believes that we need all the low carbon options, I'm very surprised not to have heard the word nuclear be mentioned by any of the panelists so far. I just wondered if there was any thoughts.
Well, there was something that came into my email inbox the other day that showed a vast percentage of Glasgow's power has been nuclear over the past few days, because it's been very quiet. But just referring to that, and I'd like to ask the panel about this as well, it seems to me that I'm not anti-nuclear, I should say that, but I looked into this, and the calculation is that if we build Sizewell C, we'll get it would be equivalent of 6% of UK electricity. But given that we're going to double its anticipated energy demand in the UK because of cars and heating, it will be 3%. So actually that's not much, is it, 3%? And one might argue that you don't need one nuclear power station, you need several or none. But anyway, that's just a thought. I'll put that to the...
I think Paul's desperate to get back in on that one, but I give that man a chance.
I think, Roger, does that not make the argument even stronger for more of all of the above, including more wind?
Yes, one could argue it that way, but I work for the BBC, so I'm not allowed any opinions.
Yeah, apart from that last one. But Paul, can I just check, because you and I have spoken about it, haven't we? And I really think, actually, in the last couple of months, we've crossed the Rubicon on nuclear, right? I think the government has moved from ambiguous to unambiguously, this is part of the mix. And greenlighting, hopefully, some of the big projects that you have, which I think is great news. Do you feel in the UK now that nuclear is now, at least from a policy decision level, part of the mix? And the fact that, we're not saying it on panels means we just need to catch up with the new reality, which I think is actually government have crossed that Rubicon now, or do you think still in the balance? Just get the mic in case we don't pick you up.
Sorry, I'd say there was a vote in Parliament yesterday on the first or the second reading of the RAB legislation,
Yep.
So the nuclear financing, and that showed pretty strong support. So I think we have crossed some of that Rubicon, but I think it's very interesting that the narrative hasn't kept up with that, even though, again, and maybe it's back the other half of the question, when I look at polling, one of the impacts of the current spike in costs of energy has been that the public support for nuclear as part of the mix seems to have gone up.
And can I ask you one other thing? I've just taken over your job.
No, that's fine. I'm just relaxing. It's fine.
But can I just ask you another question, which is, what do you think the UK nuclear story is? So we know that France is very nuclear. There are other parts of the world that are more nuclear. What do you think will emerge as the story of UK nuclear in the mix that's distinctive, interesting, important for us to understand?
I think the powerful thing that the UK has done is it's let the government's let the facts speak in terms of making sure that it looks at what it takes to keep a system going and to keep that system reliable, and that means nuclear in having not a major role, but a role there alongside in support of the other low carbon technologies that work and that we have here in the UK. We're blessed with lots of wind, not quite as much sun, but still, enough solar that we can use. And that fact-driven view of the story of a system that's going to work with demand management with electric vehicles, I think, is the UK's contribution.
Is it okay if I take over now again, Tony? Thanks.
Please. Have you rested?
Thank you. No, just to leave the microphone, just for 1 second, because I want one more question on nuclear, then we will move on, I promise. The nuclear industry has recently taken to saying, oh, look, we've got all this intermittency with wind, you need base load, you need a solid nuclear base load. The problem is, and this is why I'm ambivalent about nuclear, I really genuinely don't have a view, is that nuclear is singularly unfitted to a world in which renewables are virtually free at the point of delivery if the wind is blowing, and nuclear is extremely expensive. So you're basically paying nuclear to generate electricity when you could get it much more cheaply elsewhere. And it just doesn't. It's unfortunate, but it kind of just doesn't fit. And I think that's one of the reasons why the government has been vacillating over it over the past few years. And then we will move on after this.
If I may, Roger, can I give you a two-part answer to that? I was speaking on a
no,
panel.
Look, just pretend it's one, okay? Just pretend.
Yeah, I was speaking on a panel earlier, actually, as part of an event in the Blue Zone, pointing out that for, I think it's 35 years now, France has operated with a big chunk of its generation coming from nuclear, and nuclear is flexible. Nuclear is used to provide some of that flexibility to meet.
But you can't turn off a nuclear power station.
You can turn a nuclear power station up and down.
Yes.
And you can, France can move over the course of a day about 30% up or down in terms of the production from its nuclear stations, with proven technology and no impact on the safety, the reliability, the longevity of the station. So it's, there is a case study that nuclear can do that, what you're talking about. The second piece of it, though, is that this is all about having a system that works together, and we're talking about the very real challenges that come not just from having too little wind or too little solar, but having too much at some times. And yes, we can store some of that in lots more batteries, and hopefully some of those batteries drive around. But we need to worry, particularly in the UK, about what happens for what the Germans call the Dunkelflaut, the 2-week high pressure, dark winter, low wind periods, and we've got to have a system that works through all of that. And that's why I think, whether it's nuclear or whether it's biomass with capture and storage, or whether it's fossil with capture and storage, or whether it's hydrogen, we need something that's going to be there for that. And I want us to keep all of those technologies in the mix, and that's what I'm arguing for.
Wouldn't hibernation be the cure? I'm going to look to this side because I haven't taken anybody from this side yet. Any hands up on this side? No, you can't say anything else. No.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, she did.
See anybody from this side? Anybody from nearly this side? This is a man at the back.
Shall I answer on the trust point, though?
Yes.
So, I agree. I think it is a very opportune moment to redefine what success is in energy for consumers. And I think for way too many years, the only definition of success was switching. Actually, bring much more attention on we shouldn't be using energy. We should be using as little as possible. And this high energy prices, isn't that a great call for action to really accelerate insulation? And I shall say, that puts aside the blocking of M25 and other places, but really accelerate on energy efficiency and define our success as being smart about energy use and energy efficient, and about time in day usage, and that being the policy and the public dialogue, not switching. Competition is only means towards delivering value for customers. That's why I go back to start from the customer, what creates value from them. And on heating, we have to start now, because I actually have some good stats that my colleagues have pulled for me. Do you know that in the UK, it took us 40 years to get central heating adoption? So I'm just looking which page I had that on, but anyway, it took us a very, very long time. So it was something like...
Well, you'll find it, apparently.
Yeah, there it is. 6% in 60, 30% in 70, 60 in 80, and we only reached 90% of central heating in 97. So the amount of time it will take us to address decarbonized heating, it is now time to start and use this moment, this year, COP and energy prices, to start putting attention on that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the very fact why the government, very sagely to begin with, decided it would decarbonise the electricity sector first. Because however hard it is, it's damn easy compared with buildings. Anyway, I'm going to try this side again. And yes, there's a man over there with a blue jacket and something.
Thanks, Roger, and thanks for those comments about, it's Ian Calvert here from the Association for Decentralised Energy. So we advocate for demand-side response, and also on heat, which is, of course, as you pointed out, the biggest cause of carbon emissions. It's not transport, it's not power, it's heat, and that's increasingly so as we decarbonise the other sectors. I'm just picking up on your point because I think it is the most important. What do you think we or government should now do to start insulation and retrofit? And I'm nothing to do with sticking hands on motorways, but it is an important area. So what's your call? What should they do?
Right.
Who wants to pick up this? But we'll just leave you for a second, Olga. And does anybody else want to talk on this one?
So not even so much on the policy side, but on the finance side, because obviously all of these measures that we're talking about in households have really high upfront costs, whether that's energy efficiency or heat pumps, etc. And so the finance sector has such a good role to play in managing that high upfront cost and taking advantage of that long but also predictable payback period through energy savings. So I think a few things that we're starting to see emerge in the UK, but also in the rest of Europe. And I think there's some really interesting innovations that we're going to see in the finance sector, especially on retail finance. Obviously, things like green mortgage products and green loan products have much better interest rates now because banks have become much better at understanding that because you're making savings on your bills, actually, as a household, you have more disposable income to actually pay back on those loans, so they're less risky than loans for other things. There's some really interesting work that's been done by the Green Finance Institute in the UK and other players in Europe where individual homes are now getting kind of digital passports on renovations. So as a consumer, you can see on your laptop exactly what your energy use looks like and what you could be investing in, how much that might cost you, how much that might save you, more importantly. But also kind of rethinking how we lend money in this space, which I think is super interesting. So there are conversations around, if as a householder you wanted to buy a heat pump and take a loan for that, you might need more than 10 years to pay that back, realistically, especially if you only use those energy savings to pay it back. So one thing we could do is attach the loan to the property and not to the householder, so people are free to move homes and they're not attached to loans that they're taking for things that they don't benefit from anymore. And I think we've seen other really good models with great collaboration between energy suppliers, the finance sector and government. And I'm thinking about ECO, for example, in the UK, which is the energy company obligation. And I think so far it's focused on households that can't afford energy efficiency measures, but we could totally do that for things like heat pump deployment, etc., where it's not the householder that bears that really high upfront cost, it's suppliers. And that could be done in partnership with the finance sector, and then suppliers pay themselves back on that cost through energy savings. So it's kind of cash flow neutral for a household. So I think there's some really interesting kind of financial innovation happening in this space. And back to my earlier point, it's just about policymakers enabling that and making sure that can happen for the finance sector. Yeah.
I think it's also worth as well, calling out the news last week around, grants essentially for heat pumps, and also looking at the tax essentially from subsidies that have been put on electricity and the ability to move that over to gas instead. So those kind of pieces of news make it reflect properly the cost of gas, actually more so to the environment as well. So I think that and the grants, we're doing a lot as well in the Octopus around how we redesign both the heat pump, but also in terms of the installation process, which of course, it's just, I think there was a point earlier, right, which was around how do you get that market up and running? We just haven't really focused on this market particularly. Yep. And so we've created like a pit stop. In Formula One, some of the teams used to create a pit stop in their like labs or whatever, and they would practice doing that. So we've now put 2 homes into a warehouse in Slough, and we are practicing installing heat pumps. And we've got guys that are looking at it, and girls, who are then redesigning that process of installing it and like things that they need to have pre-built before they get on site to a home. And how do they redesign it for a standard, I think it's like the kind of a typical semi in for the retrofitting, and how do we really optimize that and take cost out? And we see the cost coming down quite significantly already. So that's really exciting. And then I think where you do still have costs, looking at how you finance it as well. Yeah. It's very similar in terms of EVs, where that cost might be slightly higher up front, but actually financing it in different ways and looking at kind of whole life cost really makes sense for consumers.
Okay, thank you. Let me take some more questions. Is there anybody who feels aggrieved that they've had their hand up and I've kept ignoring them? Oh, we'll go to the aggrieved man with the red poppy.
Simon Verley from KPMG, one of those accountants learning to count carbon as well as pounds and dollars. My question is for you, Tony, and it's about the new climate disclosure requirements and the need for transition plans, which I think were extremely welcome and what the Chancellor announced yesterday. But isn't there a risk in only applying it to listed companies that you end up destroying value in those listed companies as we have more and more scrutiny of what they're up to and stranded assets, and then private equity steps in and doesn't have the same scrutiny? So would you support, or does the CBI support, the application of those rules to private companies as well as listed ones?
I now realise that in my job, I now have to calculate, as you're talking, every single sector of the economy and the implications and so on before I mess up. So I don't know, because give me a day or two. But I do think in general, by the way, there's a much more profound thing about our economy that you point to, which is obligations.
Why don't you know? Just start from that bit. I don't know because I haven't seen the detail of the announcement. I haven't worked out which sectors it applies to. I imagine the broader point I was going to make. Hold your skepticism a second. The broader point I was going to make was, I think in general there is something profound going on in British industry where there's a lot of disadvantages to listing in general. Right? So a lot of people are just not listing. Why would you list? Somebody said to me the other day. Right? Now that's a bit of a striking comment, is it not? And by the way, particularly in this area of the world. There's a lot of green money, right? And there's a lot of green money from a lot of places which would very happily bypass public markets and go straight to source. So my instinct, before somebody points out to me the great unintended consequence of what I'm saying, is that you're absolutely right? That you are absolutely right, that actually, completely diminishing the value of listing, and raising obligations and requirements for listed companies as opposed to others in the economy makes no sense. And so my instincts are absolutely with you, but I haven't had the scope to think about it. Octopus might have an interesting point of view, but I think you're right. We'll be expecting a CBI paper shortly. We've got time for one last question. The man here has been very patient. Oh, damn.
Julian Critchlow. I will state the vested interest, which is that I was the Director General for the last 3 years for the net zero actions by the UK government, and obviously somewhat responsible for the COP26.
Well, congratulations.
How are you feeling?
And that was going to be my question. Thank you, Tony. I was going to say that a lot of the discussion around COP26 is around tipping points, around the climate science and what we're going to, some of the tipping points we've either gone through or coming very, very soon. But I'm actually interested in the business tipping points, because if you look at what's happened in the energy sector over the last few years, in the mid-2010s we tipped, and renewables became cheaper around the world in around 2/3 of all countries. And if you look at the valuation of Tesla, you would say that given it adds up to the top 10 global automotive manufacturers, you might conclude that automotive is also tipped. So I suppose the question is, for the other 50% of carbon emissions globally, you still need a lot of things to tip. We've talked about heating, we've talked about industry, lots of different areas. So based on the panel's experience at COP26, do you feel that we have genuinely reached the tipping point where industry is going to globally move now beyond carbon?
Okay, thank you. That's a nice general question. I'm going to tie in one from the woman in the yellow jumper as well, who's somewhere back there. Yes.
Thank you.
Keep it fairly short then. I think we've got time to answer this round of questions, then we'll have to wrap up.
Yes, promise it'll be short. My name's Jane Williams. My company's People Innovation. What I'm interested in is two things. We hear about our former governor of the Bank of England and the money he's raised. How are we going to get that in the best place possible? Because he's out there with that money. And we've just said and been critical of our democracies in terms of shareholder accountability. So money could be better spent through the private equity. So even more is it important to know, how do we channel that, what was it, 125 trillion is what I read this morning, but I'm not sure that's the full amount that he's got available. So how do we get that in the right place to add to this debate and everything become much more efficient and protect our environment?
Okay, I'm going to turn this into one question, which is, how do we make that transition with the money, and how are we reaching a tipping point? So this will be a kind of final wrap-up. Raphael, do you want to start on those two combined? I think they combine well enough.
Yeah, I think it's so. To your question, Julian, on tipping points, totally right. And I think it's been so interesting working in finance in the last 18 months or so, because we've all kind of looked at each other across competitors, thinking, are we, should we, how exactly? And it's just happened now. And I think the beauty of that is that we are talking to each other across competitors, which I don't think we were really doing before on any topic. So that's been really positive. Initiatives like GFANs, it's just bankers talking to each other about how they're going to do it. And because the bankers are doing it, this is going to trickle down into the real economy that we're financing. So I'm really positive about that. I think in terms of how do we make sure that we channel private capital in the right places, that's where we'll need to continue working really closely with the science. And I think while we've reached a tipping point on carbon, and this isn't a topic for today, but we've certainly not reached it on nature and on the environment and on our impact on natural ecosystems, etc. So we have a lot further to go. And maybe just to touch on the previous question, which ties into all this around transition plans, I think everybody's going to do it, whether it's mandatory or not, because by definition, clients are asking for it, shareholders are asking for it, staff is asking for it. Our ability to recruit talent depends on this. So I think we will do it. But the kind of question that remains for virtually everybody in the market is that things might need to get a little bit worse before they really get better, and how do we account for that in transition plans? And what I mean by that is that ideally, we want the financial services to buy coal assets and buy oil and gas rigs and retire them early with smart financial programs, or even completely shift what they're doing. So we could retrofit coal plants into biomass, or oil rigs that are far offshore. We could turn them into hydrogen electrolyzers that we plug into offshore wind. But that might involve our portfolio's emissions intensity or absolute emissions going up before they go down as we go through the motions and as we do that work. So I think even though we've reached tipping points in terms of how many people are bought into this, we're not quite there yet necessarily on the decarbonisation, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Fiona.
Yeah, so on the tipping point side, I think it's really industry dependent still to some extent. So, obviously EVs, definitely it's happening now. Power sector's been talking about this forever. But then when you look at other things of transport, for example, aviation, it's a real challenge. They've got a real challenge on their hands. And so do I think that they're all going low carbon ASAP? I think there's some work to do. But I think that, the fact that the finance sector is getting behind it, I think, there's a huge amount of momentum that's going to push it in that direction. And as people are living in other bits of their lives, I think that will really help. So I think that's pretty exciting. And in terms of the efficient use of capital, actually my message on this is probably, let's not make perfect be the enemy of the good. So we have not got time to perfect the design of every system in exact detail right now. We need to move, and we need to move very quickly. So let's get on out there. Let's get out and test things. I heard an amazing podcast last week. It was the Outrage and Optimism one around talking about China and how they are testing things city level in lots of different ways, big innovation, and when they find something that works, they just go for it and they scale it. And I think there's huge opportunity for us to just be doing things and testing and iterating quickly and getting behind it as much as we can.
Yes, that's a really interesting point, because although China's premier has not turned up, they've got a large delegation, and although they've offered nothing and everybody expects them to offer something, they're still doing a hell of a lot on their own turf.
Still doing a huge amount.
Important not to forget that as we read the newspapers. Fabien.
So briefly on the tipping point, I agree. It's what I feel, it's what I see, but I would not be complacent. I think, just if we're too complacent, we may, stop a bit the momentum. So, yes, we may be there, but let's continue. And on the finance, personally, or the company believes that we need, it needs to be invested in technology. As I think the point was made about the 2 weeks low wind that could happen, and it's not in a country; it's across several countries when it happens. So all the technology doesn't exist. So advanced geothermal, advanced nuclear events, and long-term battery. This is important. All the technology doesn't exist. We'll do our piece with the weight we have, and we'll drive and we'll commit in advance as much as possible, just to drive those investment and to drive action. But the policymakers have to do their piece also, because our piece is very small eventually.
Okay, thank you, Olga.
I'm just going to pick up only on the finance point, because frankly, you guys covered the industry tipping points very well. It's I would take a different, because we are talking about government finance. I would take a slightly different slant on it. So the next wave of decarbonization is close to the consumer, and it's kind of top down and bottom up. Top down, yes, we need the standards, we need the policies like banning ICEs, but we also need to make sure we are bringing consumers with us. So helping address affordability is the first big use for that. So those who can afford can pay for it, those who cannot get the help. And of course, devil's in the detail. If you are going to do it, so actually release the money, rather than wait a year, put that aside. The other area is actually skills. So Centrica just announced that it would take 40,000 engineers to electrify heating. We have a huge gap on availability of the workforce. There's a huge reskilling required as we moved from old economy to low carbon economy, and investing that early in the education is another good use.
Yeah, Olga, that's a really good point. We haven't mentioned skills, and that was a miss. So thank you for that, Tony.
Just on tipping points, I mean, I feel that the first tipping point we've hit.
Hang on a second. I just wanted to interrupt you. It's all right.
Because I did it to you. Got me at the end. On tipping points, I think we've had a boardroom tipping point, right? And I think that's what's happened. What do I anticipate is next? I think probably the supply chain tipping point is yet to happen. But when you start to get into reporting and scope 3, I think you're going to then get to a supply chain tipping point. And as for consumer market tipping points, we've had one or two, but I think it's probably category by category. As for the point about the money, and it's very interesting in my job, because I sort of walk around and I see all the people saying, we've got loads of green money to divest and nowhere to spend and nowhere to put it. And I see lots of people who go, we need money. And it does tempt you into central planning. You sort of want to act like like China and go, okay, you guys are going to put your money there. But of course, it doesn't work like that. Private capital will go very quickly and very aggressively to where there is investable returns. And I think that's the missing piece at the moment. I just think we don't necessarily have really good markets with proven models of investment returns, certainly in things like infrastructure. And I think as soon as we have those, that's when I think the money will go to work.
Thank you. It's up to you to close the meeting.
Oh, I wouldn't want to interrupt you. I think you should close the meeting.
Right then.
One thing I will say about closing the meeting, I just want to give a big shout out to Bain for supporting us, to our panel for being there. And thank you to all of you, because I know that you have many choices of things to come to, but I won't try and sum up the discussion.
Well, that's it, isn't it?
Is that it?
Yeah, that's it.
Let me ask you one final question, if I may.
Go on.
What did you learn in this discussion? You've been covering this for a long time. What did you learn?
That's a difficult one. You're not listening. If you're chairing something, you can't take stuff in, because you're listening and wondering what the next question is going to be and where you're going to go to. But I have been doing it a long time, so I have heard a lot of it before. But the thing that's really stuck with me, just a reminder of the skills, because skills, materials, to do all this, to halve by 2030 is, Bill Gates said, I think it was the biggest task ever taken on by humankind. Definitely. I mean, by far. Absolutely by far. And I can't see how we can do it. But again, that's an opinion. I wouldn't be allowed to express that. Anyway, do you want to thank people for coming?
Yeah, listen, thank you everybody for coming, and thank you to Roger. It's always fantastic, given your experience, to have you in these sessions. And we're doing more sessions next week, so please sign up for CBI sessions. And we have a daily webinar with the New York Times. But thank you to the panel, and thank you everybody for coming. Thank you, Roger.